The memory I cling to most from that day is the light. It was a soft, buttery morning light, the kind that spills through old window panes and makes dust motes dance like tiny golden spirits. It caught in my daughter Clara's hair, turning the fine strands into a halo as her mother's pearls were fastened around her neck. Her reflection in the antique mirror was a watercolor painting of hope, all soft edges and luminous eyes. She smiled at me in the glass, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached all the way to her soul. And in that single moment, she was 7 years old again, showing me a crayon drawing of our family. But even in that perfect memory, a detail nags at me, a tiny crack in the porcelain. It was the briefest flicker in her eyes when she turned away from the mirror, a shadow that passed so quickly I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light. How could I have known that the beautiful, fragile smile she gave me in that golden light was a farewell, the last one she would ever truly mean for me? Before I dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, please like and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing more. My name is Elias, and for 30 years, my world revolved around my daughter. After her mother passed, it was just the two of us against everything. I learned to braid hair. I sat through excruciatingly long recitals for movies I didn't understand, and I held her when her first love broke her heart. I worked 2 jobs, my hands growing rough and calloused from the factory floor, all to build a small, safe world for her. A world where she would never feel the sting of want. A world where she was cherished. I thought I had succeeded. I thought the man she was marrying, Leo, was the final, gleaming piece of that world. He was handsome, of course, with a smile that could charm a snake out of its skin and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He came from money, the kind of old, quiet wealth that my family had only ever seen from the outside looking in. His parents were polite but distant, their gazes sweeping over my modest home with an air of clinical assessment during our one and only meeting before the wedding. I told myself their coolness was just a different way of being, a cultural gap between their world of country clubs and my world of overtime shifts. I ignored the faint metallic taste of unease in my mouth whenever Leo was near. Clara had assured me he was everything she'd ever wanted. "He sees me, Dad," she'd said, her eyes shining. "He understands my ambition." I wanted to believe her. I truly did. But the man I saw when she wasn't looking was different. I saw the way his smile never quite touched his eyes. I saw the subtle, dismissive flick of his wrist when I tried to tell a story about Clara's childhood. He had a way of looking at me not as her father, but as a piece of her past that needed to be managed, an inconvenient relic to be tolerated until it could be put away on a dusty shelf. Have you ever met someone and just felt, deep in your bones, that something was off? What would you do if that person was marrying your only child? You try to push the feeling down. You call it foolishness, you call it jealousy, you call it being an overprotective old man. You tell yourself that your happiness is secondary to your child's. And so, I smiled. I smiled through the engagement party. I smiled through the rehearsal dinner. And I smiled on the morning of her wedding, standing in that room filled with golden light, watching her become a bride. I chose to see only the joy and ignore the quiet dread coiling in my stomach. The drive to the venue was quiet. Clara was next to me in the passenger seat of my old, meticulously cared-for sedan, the same car I'd used to drive her to her first day of school. The vast white billows of her dress filled the small space, smelling faintly of lavender and promise. She stared out the window, her fingers twisting a loose thread on her satin glove. The silence felt heavy, not peaceful. I wanted to ask her if she was happy, if she was sure, but the words felt like stones in my throat. How do you ask a question like that on the day she's been dreaming of her whole life? How do you risk shattering the illusion? Instead, I reached over and placed my rough hand over her gloved one. "Your mother would be so proud," I said, my voice thick. For a second, her composure broke. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She squeezed my hand, a desperate, fleeting pressure. "I know, Dad," she whispered. "I love you." It was a moment of connection, a brief return to the U.S. against the world team we had always been, and it was enough to make me feel ashamed of my doubts. It was a small relief, a breath of fresh air before the suffocation began. I relaxed just a little. I allowed myself to believe that everything was going to be all right. We arrived at the sprawling estate Leo's family had rented. It was a place of impossible green lawns and stone fountains that whispered of old money. Valets in crisp uniforms hurried to open our doors. As I helped Clara out, careful not to let her dress touch the ground, Leo emerged from the grand entrance. He looked like a prince from a storybook in his tailored tuxedo. But the look he gave my car, my humble, reliable sedan parked amongst a fleet of gleaming luxury vehicles, was one of pure contempt. He didn't even try to hide it. His lip curled just slightly. He walked over, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel, and wrapped an arm around Clara's waist, pulling her away from me. He kissed her, a performative, possessive kiss for the photographers who were already swarming. He then turned his gaze on me. It was cold, appraising. "Elias," he said, the name sounding like an insult on his tongue. "Glad you could make it. Try not to get lost." He steered Clara toward the entrance, his hand firmly on her back. He was leading her away and she was letting him. Before they disappeared inside, I called out her name. "Clara, wait. I have something for you." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a tiny silver pin, fashioned in the shape of a forget-me-not. It was worn with age, the details softened, but it was the most precious thing I owned. "It was your mother's," I explained, my voice trembling slightly as I held it out to her. "She wore it on our wedding day, for something old, something blue." It was more than a pin. It was a promise, a connection to the woman she barely remembered, a piece of our family's humble, loving history. Clara's eyes widened, and for a heartbeat, I saw my daughter again. Her hand started to reach for it, but Leo stepped in between us, his body physically blocking me from her. He glanced down at the pin in my hand with an expression of mild disgust. "A bit rustic, don't you think?" he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for us. He looked at Clara, a hard, commanding look I had never seen him use with her before. "Darling, my mother got you those diamond earrings. That old thing will clash horribly. We can't have that in the photos." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The message was brutally clear. This history, my history, was not welcome in their future. The real shock wasn't his cruelty. It was what happened next. Clara's hand, which had been reaching for her mother's pin, slowly fell back to her side. She looked from the pin to Leo's cold face and then to me. Her expression was a terrible, heartbreaking mix of apology and resignation. "He's right, Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It doesn't match. Maybe I can just keep it in my purse." She wouldn't even meet my eyes as she said it, turning her face into Leo's shoulder as he guided her firmly away, leaving me standing alone on the graveled driveway with a forgotten piece of my heart in my open palm. I overheard my own eulogy just inside the grand ballroom doors. The sound hit me before the sight did, the murmur of 100 conversations, the delicate clinking of crystal glasses, a string quartet playing something elegant and forgettable in the corner. It was all so loud, yet the words that found my ear were as clear as a bell. Leo's mother, a woman named Beatrice who was carved from ice and disapproval, was speaking to a guest. Her voice was low, but it carried the sharp edge of disdain. "Of course we had to invite him," she was saying, her tone a sigh of noblesse oblige. "He's the father. A necessary prop for the photographs, you understand. Poor Clara, she's been so burdened, trying to polish that rough stone of a background. It's a miracle she turned out so well." The guest made a soft, sympathetic noise. A prop. A burden. A rough stone. Was that all I was? Was 30 years of love and sacrifice simply a stain to be polished away? I stepped back into the shadow of a marble pillar, The velvet box with my wife's pin feeling like a lead weight in my pocket. My hands were shaking. I'd faced down factory foremen. I'd worked through injuries. I'd stared down debt collectors without flinching. But the casual, dismissive cruelty of that whisper cut deeper than any physical blow. It was a poison that went straight to the soul. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of expensive lilies and perfume, and forced myself to move forward. The room was a sea of pastel silks and dark tuxedos. Faces turned to me, curious and appraising. I could feel their eyes cataloging my off-the-rack suit, my slightly worn but polished shoes, the way I held my hands, still rough from a lifetime of labor. Have you ever been in a room full of people and felt completely invisible? Or worse, visible for all the wrong reasons? That's how I felt. A ghost from a past life haunting my daughter's new, gleaming future. I scanned the room for Clara. I saw her at the head table, seated on a throne-like chair next to Leo. She was laughing at something he'd whispered in her ear, her face radiant. From this distance, she looked happy, untouchable, perfect. For a moment, I felt a surge of pure, undiluted love that almost drowned out the bitterness. Maybe Beatrice was right. Maybe my job was done. Maybe the best thing I could do now was to be a quiet, unobtrusive prop. I started the long walk toward the table, a journey that felt like crossing a barren desert. A few people offered tight, polite smiles. One of Leo's cousins, a young man with a cruel smirk, looked me up and down and then turned to whisper to his friend, who snickered. Each step was an effort. The sound of the string quartet seemed to mock me, its cheerful melody a stark contrast to the hollow drumbeat of dread in my chest. I thought finding my seat would be a simple thing, a moment of rest. I had no idea it was the designated spot for my final humiliation. As I got closer, I saw my place card. It was there, right next to Clara's mother's empty seat, which they'd left as a memorial. My name, Elias, was written in a beautiful, flowing script. And there was a chair, just one empty chair at the main table, tucked in neatly, waiting for me. I felt a small, foolish flicker of hope. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe this was their way of showing me I belonged, placing me in a position of honor beside my daughter. I reached the table, my joints aching from the tension. Leo looked up at me. His smile was wide, predatory. There was a gleam in his eyes, a flicker of something triumphant and malicious. Clara wouldn't look at me. She was suddenly fascinated by a crumb on the white tablecloth, her head bowed, her shoulders tense. That should have been my final warning. The entire table was watching me, a strange, expectant silence falling over their small group. I gave a weak, tired smile, my gaze fixed on the empty chair. It was my seat, my place. I pulled it back, the wooden legs scraping softly against the polished marble floor. I turned, my back to them all, and began to lower my weary body into the seat, ready for the ordeal to be over. I remember teaching Clara how to take her first steps in our small, sun-drenched living room. My hands weren't there to hold her up, but to hover an inch from her back, a silent promise that I would catch her if she fell. She trusted that promise, wobbling forward with a look of fierce determination. That's what support is, isn't it? The absolute certainty that something will be there to bear your weight when you need it most. So how does a man go from being the unshakable foundation of his daughter's world to finding nothing but cold, empty air where he expected a place of honor? The descent felt like it happened in slow motion. There was a fraction of a second, a moment of pure, weightless disbelief where my body understood it was falling before my mind could catch up. The world tilted sideways. I saw the underside of the table, a chaotic landscape of white linen and dark table legs. I saw the polished shoes of the guests, frozen like statues. My hand shot out, instinct screaming to break the fall, but it only managed to graze the leg of the chair as Leo yanked it away, my fingers scraping against splintered wood. Then came the impact. A sickening crack echoed in my own ears as my hip bone slammed against the unyielding marble. The shock wasn't just pain, It was a white-hot, electrifying wave that shot up my spine and exploded behind my eyes, leaving a coppery, metallic taste on my tongue. I lay there, winded, the cold of the floor seeping through the thin fabric of my suit, a damp chill that felt like finality. The room was utterly silent. 100 pairs of eyes were on me, a crumpled old man on the floor. The silence was the most terrifying part. It was a held breath, an entire room waiting for the punchline. And Leo gave it to them. He stepped forward, puffing out his chest, a triumphant gladiator surveying his kill. His voice boomed across the silent hall, filled with a theatrical, mocking authority. "The floor is your seat," he yelled, pointing a finger down at me. For a moment, his words just hung there, obscene and surreal. Then, it started. A single sharp bark of laughter from one of his friends. It was the spark that lit the fuse. An instant later, the room erupted. It wasn't just laughter, it was a symphony of contempt. There were high-pitched, cruel titters from the women in their fine dresses. There were deep, bellowing guffaws from the men in their tuxedos. But the loudest, the most piercing sound of all, was Leo's own laughter, a triumphant, braying sound that declared his absolute victory. I was no longer a person. I was a joke. The prop had served its purpose. Do you think I was too forgiving in the past? Should I have seen this coming? Through a haze of pain and humiliation, I searched for the one face that mattered. I looked to my daughter, my Clara. She was still sitting at the table, her hands covering her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking, but she wasn't laughing. She wasn't moving to help me either. She was frozen, her eyes wide with what looked like horror, but she was trapped. A beautiful butterfly pinned to a board by her new husband's cruelty. Her inaction was the real betrayal. Her silence was the sound of my heart breaking. The laughter began to subside, replaced by awkward murmurs and the scraping of chairs as people suddenly found their napkins intensely interesting. The moment was over. The joke was stale. I was just an old man who needed to be cleaned up. I tried to push myself up, my hips screaming in protest, my muscles refusing to obey. My dignity was shattered, lying in pieces on the cold marble next to me. Then, through the forest of legs and chairs, a different sound emerged. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps approaching. They weren't hurried or panicked. They were heavy, measured, imbued with an authority that silenced the remaining whispers as they drew near. A pair of immaculate, hand-stitched leather shoes, conservative, expensive, and far more understated than Leo's flashy loafers, stopped right beside my head. The crowd parted. A shadow fell over me. A hand, strong and tanned, with a heavy gold signet ring on its little finger, was extended down to me. It wasn't a gesture of pity. It was an offer of aid, direct and respectful. I hesitated for only a second before grasping it. The grip was firm, pulling me to my feet with a surprising strength that spared my injured hip. I finally looked up into the face of my rescuer. It was Leo's father, Arthur Vance. He was a man I'd met only once, a figure of quiet, formidable power. But the expression on his face wasn't amusement or anger. It was something else entirely. It was a deep, furrowed confusion, a look of profound shock and dawning recognition, as if he were seeing a ghost. He ignored his son, ignored the entire wedding party, his piercing gray eyes locked on mine. He leaned in so close his voice was a low, urgent whisper that only I could hear. "Sir," he breathed, the word a stark, impossible contrast to the scene around us. "Is that you?" The world narrowed to the space between Arthur Vance's eyes and my own. The lingering echo of laughter, the scent of lilies, the throbbing pain in my hip, it all faded into a distant hum. His question hung in the air, thick with unspoken history. "Is that you?" It wasn't just a question of identity. It was a question that reached back decades, pulling a thread from a life I had buried so deep I'd almost forgotten it existed. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. How could he possibly know? The man I was now, Elias, the factory worker with calloused hands and a cheap suit, was a carefully constructed fortress, built stone by stone to protect the man I used to be. A man who wore different clothes, who moved in different circles, who answered to a different name. A man who once saved another man's life in a place very far from this opulent ballroom. "Arthur," I said, my voice a dry rasp. Just his name. It was all I could manage, but it was enough. The recognition that flooded his face was absolute. The shock solidified into a certainty that was almost terrifying to witness. He squeezed my arm, a gesture of both support and confirmation, his knuckles white. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over his son, Leo, and his wife, Beatrice, with an expression of such cold, lethal fury that the air around us seemed to drop 10 degrees. The last vestiges of amusement on Leo's face curdled into confusion and then fear. He had expected his father to join in the joke, or at the very least, to quietly manage the mess. He had not expected this. He had not expected his powerful, untouchable father to look at him as if he were something vile he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. What would you have done if your own son had done that to a guest, let alone your new father-in-law? Arthur didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His whisper was more menacing than any shout. "What have you done?" He hissed at Leo, each word a perfectly enunciated shard of ice. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back on his son completely, a dismissal more profound than any punishment. He then faced the silent, gaping guests at the head table. His eyes, now chips of granite, settled on my empty place beside Clara. He gestured to the chair that Leo was now holding, its legs still bearing the scrape marks from my fall. "Put the chair back," Arthur commanded, his voice low and dangerous. Leo, for the first time in his life, looked utterly lost. He stammered, "But, Father, he—" Arthur cut him off with a single sharp look. "Now." It was the voice of a man accustomed to absolute, unquestioning obedience. Leo, pale and trembling, fumbled with the chair, his arrogance completely stripped away, and slid it back into its place. Arthur then did something that sent a seismic shock through the entire room. He gently but firmly guided me to that chair, his hand on my back a steady, protective presence. He waited until I was seated, my hips screaming in protest, before he addressed the silent audience. His voice, when he finally spoke to them, was no longer a whisper. It was a clear, resonant baritone that filled the ballroom, a voice that had closed billion-dollar deals and commanded boardrooms. "The wedding," he announced, his words precise and final, "is over." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Beatrice, his wife, shot to her feet, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. "Arthur, what are you talking about? Don't be ridiculous," she protested, her voice shrill. Arthur didn't even glance at her. His focus was entirely on me, his expression a complex mixture of regret, respect, and a deep, simmering rage directed at his own family. "We are leaving," he stated, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. He then looked at my daughter, Clara, for the first time. She was ashen, her eyes wide, darting between me, her new husband, and her terrifying father-in-law. Arthur's voice softened almost imperceptibly when he spoke to her. "Clara," he said, and for the first time, he sounded almost gentle. "You have a choice to make." He didn't need to elaborate. The choice was clear: a life with the boy who had humiliated her father, or an alliance with the man who had just dismantled him. The room held its breath. Clara looked at Leo, whose face was a mess of fear and entitled indignation. Then she looked at me, sitting in the chair I should have occupied all along, a broken old man who was suddenly at the center of a storm. Her face was unreadable. She was trapped between the past I represented and the future she had just pledged herself to. And I realized with a fresh wave of grief that I honestly didn't know which one she would choose. The silence stretched, a taut wire of tension, as my daughter stared across the table, her choice holding the power to either save me or destroy me completely. In the deafening silence of that ballroom, Every tick of the grand clock on the wall felt like a hammer blow against my ribs. Clara was the epicenter of it all, a fragile statue in a storm of her own making. Her eyes, wide and swimming with a confusion so profound it looked like pain, darted from Leo's pleading face to my weary one. I saw the war raging within her. Leo was her future, the gleaming, perfect life she had been promised, a life of comfort and status I could never provide. I was her past, a history of sacrifice and scraped-together joys, a past that her new family had just publicly deemed worthless. I braced myself for the final, inevitable heartbreak. I expected her to choose him. Society, logic, and every fairy tale she'd ever been told dictated that the princess chooses the prince, not the old, broken king. But what happened next shocked everyone, most of all me. A single crystalline tear rolled down Clara's cheek, but her expression hardened. The soft, pliable girl I had raised disappeared, and in her place was a woman forged in the fire of that moment's humiliation. She pushed her chair back, the sound a screech of finality against the marble floor. She stood up, her spine straight, and looked not at me, but directly at Leo. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "I can't be married to a man who could do that." Leo's face crumpled, the arrogant smirk replaced by a look of genuine pathetic shock. "Clara, baby, it was a joke," he pleaded, reaching for her hand across the table. She recoiled, as if his touch were acid. "A joke?" she repeated, her voice gaining strength, ringing with a disbelief that was almost biblical in its scale. "You threw my father to the floor. My father, who gave up everything for me. You made him a punchline in front of all these people, your people, and you laughed." She turned to the silent, watching guests, her gaze sweeping over them with a contempt that mirrored her father-in-law's. "And all of you laughed with him." She then looked at her mother-in-law, Beatrice, whose face had gone rigid with fury. "You called him a prop. I heard you. A rough stone." Clara picked up her champagne flute, her hand steady, and deliberately poured the bubbling liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. The golden stain spread like a disease. "I am the daughter of that rough stone," she said, her voice now cold and hard as diamond. "And I would rather be dust than be part of a family that mistakes cruelty for humor." Arthur Vance watched this transformation with a grim, unreadable expression. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a sign of respect for the woman his son had so grievously misjudged. He then turned his attention back to me. "Elias," he said, the name now filled with a weight it hadn't carried before. "We have a lot to talk about, but not here." He gestured toward the exit with his head. "My car is waiting." The implication was clear. He was not just ending the wedding. He was extracting me from it. He was choosing me, a man he hadn't seen in 30 years, over his own blood. As I slowly, painfully pushed myself to my feet, leaning heavily on the table, Clara came around to my side. She slipped her arm through mine, her touch a silent, fierce apology. Her support was real this time, a physical and emotional bulwark against the stares of the room. Together, the three of us, the disgraced father, the defiant bride, and the formidable patriarch, began the long walk out of that ballroom. We left behind a scene of utter chaos, a jilted, humiliated groom, a furious mother of the groom, a ruined party, and 100 stunned guests whispering in our wake. No one tried to stop us. The authority radiating from Arthur was an invisible wall, parting the crowd before us. We stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, which felt like the first clean breath I had taken in hours. A sleek black town car was idling by the curb, a silent, powerful machine. A driver in a dark suit held the rear door open. Arthur gestured for me to get in first. As I ducked my head to enter the plush leather interior, I paused and looked back. Leo had followed us out onto the grand stone steps. His face was a wreck of desperation and rage. "Clara!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Don't do this, you're my wife." Clara didn't turn around. She simply got into the car beside me without a word. Arthur was the last one in. Before he closed the door, he looked at his son, his expression not of anger anymore, but of a deep, weary disappointment. "You are no longer my son," he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. "You are a disgrace to the Vance name. I will have my lawyers contact you." He then shut the door, the solid, expensive thud sealing Leo out of our lives forever. The car pulled away from the curb in a smooth, silent glide. I watched the grand estate, the scene of my greatest humiliation, shrink in the rearview mirror until it was gone. I was sitting in a stranger's car next to a daughter I barely recognized, my body aching, my heart a ruin. The silence inside the car was as heavy as the silence in the ballroom had been. I didn't understand what was happening. Why was this powerful man, Arthur Vance, doing this? What debt from the past could possibly warrant such a cataclysmic response? I turned to look at him. He was staring out the window, his jaw tight, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. After a long moment, he finally turned his gaze to me. "Da Nang, 1972, he said, his voice low and rough with memory. The medevac chopper was down. We were surrounded. I took a piece of shrapnel to the leg. I was bleeding out in a ditch waiting to die." He paused, his gray eyes locking onto mine, seeing past the wrinkles and the cheap suit to the young medic I had once been. And then a kid, a medic with the craziest blue eyes I'd ever seen, crawled through enemy fire, dragged me out of that ditch, and saved my life. His name wasn't Elias, it was Will. He leaned forward, the intensity of his stare pinning me to the seat. "I spent 30 years looking for that kid, Will, to thank him, to repay him. I never thought I'd find him on the floor of my son's wedding." I was no longer Elias, the factory worker. In the plush, silent interior of that car, 30 years of carefully constructed reality dissolved. I was Will again. Will, the 19-year-old medic who believed he could outrun ghosts by changing his name and his life. But ghosts have a way of waiting. Arthur's words didn't just unlock a memory. They broke down the door to a room in my soul I had sealed shut and sworn never to enter again. The smell of mud and cordite, the percussive rhythm of mortar fire, the slick, horrifying warmth of Arthur's blood on my hands. It all came rushing back with the force of a tidal wave. I had saved his life, yes, but the war had taken pieces of me in exchange, pieces I thought were gone forever. I had come home a different man, unable to reconcile the boy who left with the haunted shell that returned. So I buried Will. I became Elias. I chose a simple life, a life of physical labor, a life where the only thing that mattered was providing for my little girl. I never told Clara. How could I explain the nightmares? How could I describe the man I had been? A man who had seen and done things that had no place in the peaceful world I was trying to build for her. "I looked for you," Arthur continued, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Gratitude, guilt, awe. "After I was airlifted out, I asked for your name, your unit. By the time I recovered enough to start a proper search, you were gone. It was like you vanished from the face of the earth." He shook his head, a gesture of profound, decades-long frustration. "I built my entire company on a second chance you gave me in that ditch. Everything I have, my fortune, my legacy, it's all built on a debt I could never repay." He looked at me, his eyes shining with an unshed moisture. "And my son, my own son, uses that legacy to spit on you, to throw the man who saved my life onto the floor like a piece of trash." The rage was back in his voice, a controlled, white-hot fire. "That is not just an insult, Will. That is a sacrilege, an unforgivable stain on my honor and the honor of my family." The car sped along the highway, leaving the world of the wedding far behind, but we were traveling much further than that. We were traveling back in time, to a muddy field on the other side of the world where two young men, a bleeding soldier and a terrified medic, had forged a bond of life and death. Clara had been silent through all of this, her hand still gripping my arm. Her face was a canvas of shock, She was looking at me as if for the first time not as her simple, predictable father, but as a complete stranger, a man with a secret history of heroism and trauma she had never suspected. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice small, a child's voice. "Is this true? You were a medic? In a war?" I couldn't speak. I just nodded, the gesture feeling heavy, inadequate. The fortress I had built was gone, and I was exposed, vulnerable in front of the one person I had always tried to protect. The betrayal from the morning returned, but this time it was my own. I had betrayed her with my silence by denying her half of my story, half of who I was. I thought I was protecting her, but perhaps I had only been protecting myself. The car finally pulled up to a towering glass skyscraper in the heart of the city, the headquarters of Vance Industries. Arthur led us not to an office, but to a private penthouse apartment at the very top, a place of quiet, minimalist luxury with panoramic views of the city lights beginning to sparkle in the twilight. There, in that quiet space high above the world, the final pieces fell into place. Arthur, with a grim efficiency, made 2 phone calls. The first was to his legal team, instructing them to begin annulment proceedings for Clara's marriage immediately, and to set up a trust fund in her name that would make her financially independent for life. "He will not get a penny," Arthur stated, his voice flat and absolute. The second call was to the board of his company. "Leo is finished," he explained to me after he hung up. "I'm removing him from the company, from the family trust, from everything. He is on his own." It wasn't just punishment, it was an erasure. Arthur was systematically dismantling the world his son had taken for granted. He then turned to me. "As for you, Will," he said, his voice softening, "my debt to you is immeasurable, but I want to try to repay it. I have a position for you, head of my company's charitable foundation. You'd be helping veterans, families, doing the good you were always meant to do. No more factory floors. It's yours if you want it." He handed me a business card, his own personal card with a number scrawled on the back. It was an entire world on a small piece of cardboard. A new beginning. A return to a life of purpose I thought I had lost forever. I looked at Clara. Her eyes were full of tears, but she was smiling, a real smile, the first one I'd seen all day. It was a smile of pride, of love, of rediscovery. In the wreckage of her wedding day, she had not lost a husband. She had found her father, the real one. The circle was complete. The day began with a lie, a beautiful, fragile illusion in a sunlit room, and it was ending here, with a hard, painful, but ultimately liberating truth. The humiliation I endured on that marble floor was not the end of my story. It was a violent, shocking catalyst that had to happen. It was the crack that broke the dam, letting a lifetime of secrets and old debts pour out, washing away the past and clearing the ground for a future I never could have imagined. I took the card from Arthur's hand, my own calloused fingers closing around the crisp, clean edges. "Thank you, Arthur," I said, my voice steady. I think Will would like that very much. The most important lesson I learned that day is that you can never truly bury your past. It lives in you, breathes in you, and sometimes it comes back not as a ghost to haunt you, but as a key to unlock the future you were always meant to have. True honor isn't found in wealth or status, but in the debts of loyalty you pay and the courage you show when everything is on the line. What do you think is the most important quality in a family? Loyalty, honesty, or forgiveness? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.